Explosion, guys! What's up? My name is Eel, a Russian guy who decided to create his English YouTube channel. Woo! And today, surprise, surprise, I'm not alone. I'm with my watchers, which helped me to film the previous video. But today, they will help me to film another one. What the good watchers really pay the big respect to them. In this video, we will try to say MrBeast 1000 times in 10 minutes. Yeah, it kind of looks easy, but we need to say MrBeast at least 100 times in 60 seconds in order to be able to achieve the result which we want. Is it easy? I don't know, today we will find this out. All we know the videos where the person sits in front of his computer, for example, for 10 hours, watching the same video or saying the same thing for many times. It's all great, but today this is not the goal of our video. Today we are counting time and we are challenging ourselves. So yeah, right now I'm putting 10 minutes here. 10 minutes, reliable as always. And we also have a special program from the internet which counts the spacebar clicks. So every time I will say MrBeast, I will click the spacebar, and in such way we will be able to count 1000 times of saying MrBeast. So without any other notes, let's begin. At the same time which I will click, I will start to count. Is it working? It's working. Great. It's super hard challenge. I already feel it with my butt. 1, 2, 3. MrBeast, 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 yo rap, MrBeast, 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 Spins, MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 Mrs. Pierce, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Pierce, Mr. Pierce, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Up. Oh my god, my tongue! I'm sweating right now. It was like a super exercise. I mean, I'm not sweating so much in the gym. It was super hard. But as we see, boom, I did it! 24 seconds left, so this probably means I will be able to say 1050 times, maybe something like that. Still have a lot of space for improvement, but we did it for now! And that's it for today's video. If you want to support me, feel free to subscribe, put a like, and also leave your comment, maybe with some other challenges or doubts. Will you be able to do it faster or slower? Let me know. But it was your boy Eel. See you in the next videos. Bye bye.